managed to, I won't say cure all my health issues, although I was able to fire my doctor ultimately because I didn't need him anymore, because you can't really say something's cured if it's the result of a bad diet, right? It's only going to be fixed so long as you are not eating that diet. So it's been the single biggest change in the human diet over the last 150 years has been the decline in fats of animal source and the increase in fats of vegetable source, which are primarily seed oils. Higher intakes of seed oil caused a lowering of cholesterol, which they knew was going to happen when they started, but the people with the lowest cholesterol then had the highest rates of cardiovascular disease.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We've got with us today a special guest, Tucker Goodrich, who I talked to several years ago in an interview format, and we interact not infrequently on the, I guess, what's formerly Twitter is now X. So, Tucker, welcome. Good talking to you again. I'm glad to see you're still fighting a good fight. And for those that aren't familiar with you,
good to see you.
Yeah,
I was hoping you'd be wearing purple hair today, but I guess I can't have everything.
I can go downstairs and get my wig. For those that aren't familiar, Tucker, you have been I guess I would say a fairly vocal advocate for the fact that some of these added oils that we've been consuming over the last, over a century now, have had a deleterious effect on our health. I guess that's fair to say. Would you say that's fair to say?
That's definitely fair to say.
Provide us your background, if you don't mind. I know your background wasn't strictly in science. I know you had, I think, more of a business background, but you've taken a personal interest in this particular topic and have gone in incredible depth in this. So for those, we'll just spend just a couple minutes on this because I want to get into the heart of the matter if we can.
Yeah, I was a science geek growing up, but didn't. Shawn, you'll probably appreciate this. I had to dissect the fetal pig and only got a B+ in the test. The teacher explained to me that I never touched it with my hands. I only used the instruments. And at that point, I realized that a career in medicine was probably not in my future if I was that squeamish. But I always had a real interest in it. I got into Wall Street and originally as a salesman and then as an analyst, and then started taking on technology tasks. And my approach to that was always just applied scientific method. And it turned out it was very good. And it turned out I was very good at that. And I wound up at one point, two of the largest 100 hedge funds in the world were running on systems that I had designed. And that's being a self-taught computer scientist. Then I got into risk management. Company I was working for needed a risk management system and asked me to build one. So that was another thing I had to teach myself. And we wound up having, I've been told, one of the best risk management systems on Wall Street. And that was by a former colleague of mine who went to work at JP Morgan and was complaining about how poor their systems were compared to what I had built. So when my health started seriously declining and I started trying to figure out what the answers were, I had a pretty good toolkit of problem solving and being a leader in my field on Wall Street, and with a good understanding of the application of scientific method in an engineering context where generally, if you're chief technology company, you're the chief technology officer of a hedge fund on Wall Street and something goes by, literally you have a bunch of partners standing around your desk wondering when you're going to fix it. So you need to be able to assess problems quickly and fix them rapidly and reliably, and ideally build systems that don't break in the first place, which I was also very good at. So then when I started getting sick, I started doing a lot of reading and research. I was talking to my doctors about my conditions and learned that I was pretty good at figuring out what was going on there as well. Managed to, I won't say cure all my health issues, although I was able to fire my doctor ultimately because I didn't need him anymore, because you can't really say something's cured if it's the result of a bad diet, right? It's only going to be fixed so long as you are not eating that diet. But I will say that was in 2000, and I have been in perfect health ever since, aside from occasional dumb thing like a broken rib or falling off your mountain bike. And then I got interested in this seed oil topic and started doing research there, realized that there was there were a lot of folks who were saying they were bad, but nobody could explain why they were bad. So I got interested in that, and that turned out to be a very interesting field of exploration.
Yeah, and I guess it's fair to say that if we've watched this progress over the last, maybe 5 years, and there's been a sort of explosion of people that are demonizing seed oils or been critical of them. That's gone, and then of course you've seen the inevitable pushback on that. Now there's a whole bunch of people that are now like, no, seed oils are fine, and this is why. And so it's interesting to watch the back and forth between that. In your view, what are seed oils? Let's just start with that. What exactly are seed oils, and what are we concerned about?
A seed oil is a subset of vegetable oils. There are seed oils and fruit oils. Fruit oil is something like olive oil, where it's made from the soft outer part of the fruit. Seed oils are made from the actual seed of the fruit. They are typically high in omega-6 fatty acids, specifically one called linoleic acid, which is the main topic of interest in this area. And they are something that was fairly uncommon in the human diet up until first we started running out of meat 10,000 years ago. And then recently, with the Industrial Revolution, we were able to start extracting seed oils wholesale from seeds. And it went from being a tiny portion of the human diet to being, one study I saw said 21% of our calories in the United States are coming from seed oils now. So it's been the single biggest change in the human diet over the last 150 years has been the decline in fats of animal source and the increase in fats of vegetable source, which are primarily seed oils such as soybean oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, and the like.
And obviously, you've probably looked at this as much as anybody that I'm aware of. What do you think the main, or what do you think the deleterious effects are of those on our body? Because there's a lot of people that are out there will say that we don't have good human data that shows that they're actually problematic. In fact, they're good for us. In fact, there's studies that show that there's decreases in heart disease when we look at observational studies, and clearly they're associated with lower LDL cholesterol, which is the ultimate goal of everyone's health. That's what we're told about that. But why do you think they're a problem?
There's a problem first with the epidemiology that they're using, right? Dietary epidemiologists, starting with Ansel Keys, are guys. There's an old joke about a policeman walks into an alley and there's a drunk crawling around under a streetlight. And the cop asks him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm looking for my car keys." And he says, "Did you lose them here?" He said, "No, I lost them over there." And he points off into the dark alley. And the cop says, "Why are you looking here?" And he says, "This is where the light is." Okay, makes sense. But the problem in epidemiology is that epidemiologists can generally only look where they have the tools to look, right? So when Ansel Keys did his research, he had a bunch of universities in other first world countries volunteer to help him out. So he only looked in those countries, right? He didn't go try to select a random population to get a view of what's happening. As Shawn and I have talked about, there are lots of populations out there who eat a high meat diet and are in excellent health, but they're not the ones that the epidemiologists are generally first studying because they're hard to study. They're not near a university. They're often don't have electricity, so it's hard. So the epidemiologists are generally only looking at first world countries. And the problem with first world countries is that nutritional epidemiology started almost 100 years after we started consuming large amounts of seed oils. So they're looking at what's called the ubiquitous trait, right? When you do an RCT, for instance, a heart disease RCT, you don't have a control arm. Both arms have been eating seed oils for a long time. Now, you may increase one arm and see what happens between the two of them, but you're not actually ever seeing a population with a no seed oil diet. Now, they're out there and medicine has looked at them, but they're not doing it in the context of comparative epidemiology. So what do you see when you look at an actual control arm? You look at a population that doesn't consume seed oils at all, right? They're typically primitive. They typically live out in the middle of nowhere on an island in the South Pacific or in the Amazonian jungle. That they don't have heart disease, right? or any of the other diseases that we call diseases of civilization or chronic diseases. They don't have diabetes. They don't have obesity. They don't have heart disease. They don't have autoimmune diseases. They don't have all the things that make around 90% of Americans to be sick, right? So if you're an epidemiologist and all you're looking at, it's like George Davey Smith, one of the famed epidemiologists, gave the example of trying to figure out what causes lung cancer. If you're looking at a population where everybody smokes, all you're doing is comparing people who smoke 2 packs a day to people who smoke 5 packs a day. You may never see a difference in lung cancer because it may be that the amount of smoking that causes lung cancer is 1 pack a week, right? You have to have an appropriate control arm. And unfortunately, epidemiology doesn't do that when they're looking in this area. For the most part, there are a few exceptions.
Yeah. And so how do we tease that out? What data are you looking at that make you say, hey, this is convincing me that these things are an actual problem, since we don't have human population data that shows group A versus group B? They're all more or less the same thing. Where do you see the differences at? Is it animal studies? Is it mechanistic studies? Where do we go?
The human population data that we have are guys who've gone to these primitive societies and then tried to figure out what's going on with their health. There's Staffan Lindenberg, who went to there's a tribe in Bolivia called the Chimane that has been extensively studied of late because lo and behold, they don't get heart disease. And
but I guess
that's really neat.
I guess, Tucker, if you're looking at these primitive tribes, there's a lot of things that are different between them and than the rest of the population. So how do you say, hey, it's a seed oil and not 50 other things?
So one of the most interesting studies was a study that was done in the 1960s, and they looked at genetic populations who had immigrated to the United States. And they compared Africans to African Americans. They compared Japanese to Japanese Americans. They compared Koreans to Korean Americans. And what they discovered was that all of these populations in their native environment, and Japan's an important country to include there because they were a first world country in 1960, right? They were a first world country long before World War II, right? So a lot of the variables that you're looking at with these primitive tribes don't really pertain to the Japanese. And what they did is that people in these countries, before they move to the United States, have fractional to 0 rates of heart disease. They looked specifically, the most interesting group was African Americans. In the 1960s, nowadays, we know that African Americans have a very high risk of heart disease and the other chronic diseases. In the 1960s, their rate of heart disease in the United States was half of white Americans. But if you then went and looked at Africans living in Africa, I think it was Nigeria or Uganda, they did 4,500 autopsies at death looking for signs of heart attack. And as we can discuss, when you have a heart attack, it leaves permanent scarring in your heart, and that never heals. So you can tell if somebody got run over by a bus, you can do an autopsy and tell that they had a heart attack at some point in their life. So how many heart attacks did they find amongst these 4,500 Africans? In the United States, for a similar population, the rate would have been 12.5% up to 24% if you were, I think it's 24% if you were a white American. The rate in Africa was 0. Right? 0%. Now, since then, what we've seen in Japan at the time, it was 3% if you looked at the entire country. If you looked at the rural areas of Japan, it was around a 1% rate of heart attack, right? Japan is interesting because we know when the Japanese started eating seed oils en masse because the United States introduced them into their diet after World War II and took a major effort to do so. Japanese, being a first world country, being one of the countries that can do first world epidemiology, has extensively tracked the growth of seed oil consumption and the growth of chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and cancer rates specifically in Japan. So if you take a broad look at the epidemiology, meaning if you make sure to include the populations where they're not consuming seed oils, then you see there's a clear dichotomy, right? There isn't a single population anywhere in the world that I'm aware of who does not consume seed oils, who has high rates of any of the chronic diseases. Most of them are 0 rates or close to 0.
So we talk about a seed oil, and there's obviously, you mentioned there's several different types. There's sesame seed oil, there's corn oil, canola oil, rapeseed oil. What is the actual, do we have an idea of what the actual chemical, because you mentioned things like linoleic acid, is it just that, or are there multiple things? Because you can get linoleic acid in forms other than coming from seed oils, and maybe they don't have the same beef, for instance.
Yep.
So what is the specific issue with this particular product? Is it a multiple compounds? Is it the oxidation of it? Or what's going on here?
It seems to be a case of the dose makes the poison, and we can go into why linoleic acid is problematic. But the National Institutes of Health did a study in 2012 looking at seed oils and obesity. And they did a lot of the epidemiology work in the United States, looking at the increased consumption of seed oils over the course of the 20th century. And what they found was that when records began in 1909 to when they wrote the paper, the consumption of linoleic acid in the US diet had gone from 2% to 8%, about 8%. What they did was model that increase in a rat study, or a rodent study, mouse study, actually. And what they found was that 2% linoleic acid was not enough to cause obesity in these rodents, but 8% was enough to cause mass obesity, which mimics what's happened in the US population over that same period of time, where when we all were growing up, when Shawn and I, who were about the same age, were growing up, fat kids were rare. And now, childhood obesity is becoming the norm. It's not an exception anymore. 150 years ago, if you were obese, you could get a job in the circus, right? Barnum and Bailey featured a fat man, and people would pay money to go and look at him. Nowadays, the vast majority of people, when you walk around, are overweight, if not obese. It's been a sea change, and it mimics what they were able to demonstrate is the case in these rodents. And that experiment has been repeated several times now. The most recent version was done by a guy who used the same diets and was able to demonstrate that not only does an increase in linoleic acid consumption cause obesity, but it also causes another one of the chronic diseases that we're seeing an epidemic of in the United States, which is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Again, a disease that wasn't even known before the 1980s in the United States. The first person they diagnosed with it, they thought it was a little old lady. They thought she was an alcoholic because it looked like alcoholic fatty liver disease. And she said, "I've never had a drink in my life." And now we know through experimentation in human children that soybean oil, for instance, can reliably cause fatty liver disease in humans. And that if you replace the soybean oil with a fish oil, which contains very low levels of linoleic acid, similar to what you would see in an evolutionarily appropriate diet, or for instance, if you ate mostly beef, that the fatty liver disease goes away. And kids can live for years on a non-seed oil based lipid infusion into their veins and be in perfect health. Even kids who are on the verge of death with fatty liver disease.
How do we tease out, if I look at where are we getting this food in our diet, most of it, I would assume, is coming from ultra-processed foods, additives, because you look on the store shelves, everything's safflower oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, on and on. You look to the packaged foods, and it's there. So how do we know it's just not the consumption of these packaged foods, the refined grains with the sugars added? And it seems to be a packaged deal. How do we know this is a unique individual effect rather than the cumulative effect from all these foods together?
Back to the Chimene population in Bolivia, in the Amazonian jungle in Bolivia, the researchers studying them noticed that they were starting to get fat like everybody else. So they did an intensive study of what was changing in their behavior and their diet. And the first thing they blamed was amusingly motorboats. The people who were getting fattest, the quickest in that population were the people who had motorboats. Now, obviously, motorboats don't cause obesity, but if you're living in the Amazonian jungle and you have a motorboat, you can get to a store and you can buy vegetable oil to use as your cooking fat. So they pointed the finger in a group that was primarily still eating their ancestral population, that just the introduction of seed oils was enough to cause obesity in that population, right? Scientists like John Speakman, who's a leading researcher into obesity, has done experiments in rodents. And when we speak about rodent studies here for a moment, I interviewed a scientist recently, Tom Brenna, who is a guy who was part of the Dietary Guidelines Committee, a leading U.S. diet researcher. And he explained that I think exactly what he said was human studies are the worst, right? In an animal model, you can control every single variable, including the genetics, right? You can't do that in a human study. So, obviously we don't have gene knockout humans for the most part, except when it occurs naturally. So in a rodent study, Speakman went through and looked at the 3 macronutrients, right? Protein, carbohydrates, and fat, and varied each macronutrient across a wide range. And the only one that made a difference was the fat content. Now, unfortunately, in that study, he was using a diet that mimicked the US diet in terms of the fat composition. But what he saw was that as you increase the fat content, there's a middle ground where you get maximal obesity. And then as you go more and more towards a ketogenic diet, you see the obesogenic effect of fat starting to wear off. So if we take that study and we take the other studies where they're varying the composition of the different fats in the diet, that you don't need anything but an increased linoleic acid content in the diet to cause obesity, right? You don't need rodent diets are generally ultra processed foods, right? But you don't need dyes, you don't need preservatives, and you can block the obesogenic effect of this fat through a variety of different mechanisms, right? You can use vitamin K, which protects linoleic acid from oxidation, which is something we should talk about. You can use pharmaceuticals like rimonabant that block the effect of linoleic acid on your hypothalamus and your gut, right? And you can use stimulation of the antioxidant system in the body, which will also prevent obesity through a pathway that starts at linoleic acid in the diet and ends with a obesogenic toxin in the body.
So how do we, because some people say it's a caloric effect. We've seen an increase in caloric consumption, oil consumption in the U.S. diet significantly since the 70s, but it's more calories. It's just you're eating more calories, and it's not an independent effect of the molecule. Like, again, the critics will say LDL goes down, blah, blah, blah. How do we tease that out from in humans, not rats? Because obviously we're not rats, and there's problems extrapolating mouse data to human data. How do we say, yeah, go ahead.
Problems in some circumstances, not in this one. So how do we do that? There's a couple of different things you can do. You can give people a drug, right? Determine what the mechanism of the drug is in a mouse model, give it to people, see if it has the same effect on humans, right? We have 2 drugs, rimonabant, which was banned for human consumption, which we can go into. That was an effective anti-obesity drug, and interestingly enough, also improved every other aspect of chronic disease. This was an anti-obesity drug that would also lower HbA1c, even if you didn't lower your carbohydrate intake. And then we have these GLP-1 inhibitors, Ozempic, Wegovy, forget the third one, that have become very popular, right? We start looking at the mechanisms of those drugs. They're working through this pathway, right? The GLP-1 inhibitors reduce that obesogenic toxin that is derived from linoleic acid in the body called HNE, which is why they're not only good for obesity, they're good for other chronic diseases. They're starting to use those for heart disease. They're looking at using them in neurodegeneration. So we got to take science. A lot of people say, oh, the only thing that matters is a human RCT. But if you're trying to figure out why something is happening, you can't use a human RCT, right? In some cases, for instance, when they had finally figured out what was causing this fatty liver disease in children who have a condition called short gut syndrome, they all thought that it was the soybean oil that they were injecting into their veins as a calorie source, right? But they couldn't do an RCT because word had gotten out in the parent population and it was determined to be unethical to do a human RCT. So the FDA approved this treatment without a human RCT to confirm the effect because the effect was so powerful and because so widely well recognized at that point that they tried to do an RCT in Hong Kong and they weren't able to recruit anyone for it because all the parents refused to have their children in the control arm. So yes, the calorie point, it's always calories, right? If you want to gain weight, you need to eat more calories. If you want to lose weight, you'll eat less calories than you're burning, right? That's a tautology, as Gary Taubes is fond of pointing out, right? We're not repealing physics here. The question is, why did not only humans start eating more calories, but why did all of the animals that live in the human sphere of diet also start eating more calories and also start gaining weight and getting all of these chronic diseases? Right? That's the real question. And the answer we have to that, based on our 3 extant treatments, we have pharmacology, we have surgery, and we have diet alterations, right? We have several different pharmacology. We have rimonabant, we have the GLP-1 inhibitors, surgery, we have bariatric surgery, which is essentially, if you want to look at the way I look at it, is successful bariatric surgery is essentially a lobotomy that cuts off your brain from the hyperphagic signal that it's getting from your gut when you eat these fats, right? And that's been, again, back to the animal models, that's been demonstrated that bariatric surgery has the same effect on the body as the drug rimonabant does, right? And the prime effect of linoleic acid in these models is it converts to a class of endocannabinoids in your body that causes hyperphagia. It causes overeating, and it specifically causes craving of carbohydrates and sugar.
Let me just steer towards, because you mentioned chronic disease, because obesity becomes such a contentious topic and for a lot of reasons. But what about the independent effects of these compounds on development of atherosclerosis, autoimmune disease, or you name it, whatever you want to choose to look, maybe dementia, things like that, neurological disease. How do these things affect those things, maybe independent of weight gain? Because everybody will say, you only got better because you lost weight. And I don't think that's necessarily true. How do you...
Well, you and I both know that people get better before they lose weight, specifically in these bariatric surgery models.
Right. And we see people get...
Once they sever the nerves that they sever in that procedure, diabetes goes away instantly.
So can you make an argument that these particular seed oils or linoleic acid or whatever component is causing diseases independent of weight gain or loss?
For cardiovascular disease, let's also talk about diabetes, because insulin resistance is a huge risk factor and diabetes is a huge risk factor for heart disease. It's been known since the 1960s that injecting soybean oil into the vein causes insulin resistance and hyperglycemia almost immediately, right? That's the basis of this short gut syndrome, parenteral fatty nutrition line of research. It's been shown that consuming soybean oil in a similar fashion causes insulin resistance almost immediately, right? What's the biggest change that's happened in the US diet? It's the increase in soybean oil over the last 100 years. So should we be surprised that we know from human models that consuming this acutely causes insulin resistance? And I'm not talking about over a period of time. I'm talking about one meal will cause immediate insulin resistance. So if you get insulin resistance, you get high insulin and you become, I think your risk for cardiovascular disease goes up like 40-fold or something. It's a massive increase. There's only one explanation given in the cardiovascular literature for what causes heart disease, and that is the oxidation of omega-6 fats in lipoproteins, right? This was originally demonstrated back in the 1970s by Brown and Goldstein, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the LDL receptor. One of their experiments was the first step of atherosclerosis is the conversion of macrophages, which are a type of white blood cell, into what are called foam cells, which are these cells that are engorged with fat and cholesterol, right? And the idea was that they were consuming LDL, and that's how they were becoming engorged. So they did an in vitro experiment where they incubated macrophages with LDL, and nothing happened. They couldn't initiate the first step of atherosclerosis using normal LDL. they had to use a modified LDL. And the modification that they used was acetyl LDL, which is not something that happens in the body, but it did stimulate the macrophages to become foam cells. So in the 1980s, Steinberg and Whitstone figured out exactly what was happening in the LDL that was causing this change in the human body. And it was the oxidation of linoleic acid, the omega-6 fat, in the LDL triglycerides and also in the LDL wall. And that stimulated these macrophages to overconsume this now oxidized LDL and to transform into foam cells. Steinberg and Whitstone went on to replicate this finding in rabbits and then in human studies, where they showed that feeding people olive oil, which is low in linoleic acid, did not cause their LDL to become susceptible to oxidation. And if you gave them seed oils, then their LDL was highly susceptible to oxidation. So in the latest statement from the cardiology profession that I'm aware of, the 2020 European Atherosclerosis Society consensus statement on what causes cardiovascular disease, they say in the title it's LDL, but if you read the paper, every single instance that they describe of what kicks off the process of atherosclerosis and perpetuates it is due to oxidized linoleic acid. They have no other explanation in the cardiovascular literature for what's causing cardiovascular disease. And I will include things like smoking in that, right? We know smoking causes cardiovascular disease, but it seems the mechanism is that it causes these fats to oxidize in your LDL and stimulate the atherosclerotic process.
Why do we see such a powerful effect of diabetes then? Is diabetes hyperglycemia or the diabetic pathophysiology leading to this oxidation as well, or is it something independent?
Yeah, hyperglycemia is essentially an accelerant. It causes more oxidation of these fats in the body and it accelerates the process. It's from a geeky science perspective, it's really interesting because if you give rodents a mixed diet, they will become very sick and very obese, meaning a diet with linoleic acid, other fats, and carbohydrates. That's the most effective way to make them ill. If you give them a diet of just linoleic acid, they don't get obese, right? They do suffer from liver failure pretty quickly, which is, of course, fatal. But it seems to need, for certain effects in the body, it seems to need cofactors. Now, in terms of diabetes, since linoleic acid consumption will cause hyperglycemia, it's almost a self-sustaining feedback loop where it's causing a rise in blood glucose, which is accelerating the oxidation of these fats and causing them to turn into toxins.
So if you consume, because you mentioned injecting soybean oil into the vein and no one does that. We consume it. And so it has to go through our digestive system, through our liver, presumably. Right. How does that affect us differently?
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you'd mentioned directing soybean oil directly in the vein causes hyperglycemia, but no one does that in real terms outside of maybe some TPN type nutrition or something like that. But as far as when we normally consume it, and I don't eat the stuff, but when humans normally consume this stuff, it has to go through our digestive system. It has to go through the liver. How does that affect us differently, or how does that work that it causes problems?
You're absolutely right about that. And our intestinal tract has lots of protective mechanisms to protect us against toxicity from seed oils and lots of other things. We all know that. Obviously, injecting stuff directly into your bloodstream is just in general a really bad idea. So some scientists in Germany in 2013 did an experiment where they took some healthy non-diabetic people, and one arm, they gave them the same treatment that they give in total parenteral nutrition, TPN. They injected soybean oil, a product called Intralipid, into their veins. And the other group, they had consume a big dose of soybean oil. And the effect on insulin resistance was identical between the two arms. So it can clearly have the same effect on us via the oral route as it does via the IV route. Now, with a very few exceptions, most of us are not chugging soybean oil, but if you are consuming it over the course of your life, we know that this fat concentrates in your body, and we know that levels in the human body, in America at least, have gone up dramatically over the course of the 20th century, from it being 2 or 3% of your adipose tissue to like 30% of your adipose tissue. So we're saturated in these fats now. Bad choice of words there on my part, but we're literally stuffed full of these fats. So it shouldn't be surprising for us to see that we're having these effects.
Is there a way outside of a fat biopsy to assess? Is there a blood test? Is there some sort of analysis you can do to say, hey, I've got X amount of my tissue is, saturated with seed oils or HNE or whatever you want to look at, and you can see it reversing over time? Has there been studies on that, or can anybody assess that themselves?
Yeah, there have been studies on that. Adipose tissue fat cells represent long-term intake. Blood is going to represent shorter-term intake. Blood cells, red blood cells, for instance, turn over in 60 to 90 days, right? That's the basis of the HbA1c test. So that's a middle term of consumption. And then short-term consumption would be looking at postprandial fat levels in the blood, right? But that's literally, okay, you've eaten a meal. What are we going to see in your blood, right? It's interesting. Fats are preferentially digested in the body. They, unlike everything else that you eat, fat bypasses the liver and gets pumped fast through your lymph system, from your intestines, through your lymph system, directly into the vein leading into your heart, right? So if you eat French fries and you consume a big load of oxidized seed oils, your body is going to absorb all of those, a substantial portion of those oxidized seed oils. And the first part of your body that's going to see it after the lymph system is your heart. From there, it goes into your lungs, then back to your heart, and then out to the rest of your body. Yeah, it's definitely possible. They've done, again, the National Institutes of Health did a study looking at seed oil consumption and migraines recently, where they altered the diet and they tracked the change in fats and serum. And also, most importantly, they tracked the change in the oxidized metabolites of linoleic acid, which are the things that are actually thought to cause all these various diseases. And a dietary change was able to not only alter all those biomarkers, but also significantly improve the migraine symptoms of these migraine sufferers. There are 3 different human studies, one in RCT, that have done that with fatty liver disease in humans. The RCT was done in India with safflower oil, canola oil, and olive oil, each with declining levels of linoleic acid. And the folks in the olive oil wing with the lowest linoleic acid had the best results. Constant intake of carbohydrates for all 3 arms. They didn't decrease carbohydrate consumption. It was 55 to 75%. But the people in the olive oil wing significantly decreased weight. They decreased their fatty liver disease score, and they reduced their insulin resistance.
There's been some folks talking about phytosterols or cytosterols and things like these plant cholesterol analogs, which come in some point from seed oils, but also from other oils which are not seed oils. Are you, and they'll say that's potentially causative when it comes to cardiovascular disease. What are your thoughts on that particular line of sterols?
I think is what you're referring to, which are plant and the plant version of cholesterol.
Right.
Is that it, Shawn?
Yeah, that's it.
Phytosterols?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, sorry. You were going in and out there a little bit. So in the fatty liver disease model, they examined that. And what they did was they gave rodents fatty liver disease by injecting soybean oil into their veins. And then they switched them over to a fish oil diet. And the fish oil diet cures the fatty liver disease. So fish oil doesn't have much in the way, if anything, of phytosterols. So what they did was they took the phytosterols out of soybean oil and put it in the fish oil. And it had no effect, no negative effect on these animals, right? In the context of a low linoleic acid oil infusion. As far as the effect on cardiovascular disease, it has the effect of lowering serum cholesterol. I don't consider lowering serum cholesterol to be a beneficial effect. So I would be inclined to avoid phytosterols in general. And I think that I don't think there's great evidence showing that they cause cardiovascular disease. Just in reading the literature on how to actually move the body through the various steps of cardiovascular disease, you're mostly looking at these linoleic acid metabolites, and you're not looking at phytosterols. But in the Minnesota coronary experiment, what they discovered was that the people with the point of that study was to lower cholesterol and thereby lower cardiovascular disease. And what they found was that higher intakes of seed oil caused a lowering of cholesterol, which they knew was going to happen when they started, but the people with the lowest cholesterol then had the highest rates of cardiovascular disease. Yeah, I don't consider any prescription that's lowering your cholesterol to be inherently beneficial. We can get into how cholesterol is involved in heart disease. It's not what we've been told to think. But yeah, I don't think the phytosterols are a good thing. We probably get some small amount of them in a natural human diet, but taking boluses of them to lower cholesterol and hopefully lower cardiovascular disease just doesn't seem like a great idea to me, especially not if you're getting them in the context of seed oils.
Let me talk about linoleic acid, which you're positing has, particularly in doses we see, is probably negative. It is an essential compound, though. We must have it in the diet. And so where should we get it from? And then I guess the other question would be that we're talking about seed oils, but there's some people that'll say that animals, pork, chicken, so on and so forth, have higher amounts of this, and we should avoid those as well. What are your thoughts on those two concepts? If we need it in the diet, and is getting it from pork and chicken or even beef a problem for us?
Yeah, a couple of people just put up some comments about omega quant. That is a good test to use for serum levels of these fats. Linoleic acid is not an essential fat. That was based on research that was done in the 1930s originally by the Burrs. It was continued by a guy named Ralph Holman through the 60s and 70s. And the one thing that they never got around to testing was if you have a diet with long chain omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, is there a requirement for linoleic acid? And the TPN crowd that was running into a roadblock in trying to get physicians to adopt Omegaven instead of intralipid to use in infants with short gut system ran into this problem where they had people saying linoleic acid is essential. I can't give them Omegaven, which has something like 0.5% linoleic acid, very small amount, because linoleic acid is an essential fat. So they did research in human children with essential fatty acid deficiencies, and they showed that you can completely resolve an omega fatty acid deficiency by using a fish oil infusion with only 0.5% linoleic acid. And then they went and this idea was based on mouse models. So they went and they did rodent models, and they showed that over 10 generations, rodents raised on a linoleic acid free diet with only DHA and arachidonic acid, the longer chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, were perfectly healthy in every respect. Interestingly enough, they also have better fertility. When I talked to Tom Brenna, he said one of the signs of linoleic acid consumption in these rodent models is a decline in fertility. So far from being essential, it's not. It was bad science to make us think that it was essential. Now, it is conditionally essential. So if you are on a diet that is deficient in the longer chain omega-6 and 3 fatty acids, it can help make up that deficiency, but it's not essential if you have enough of the other two, which is how somebody can go on, for instance, an all beef diet for decades and be totally healthy. Because in that case, you're getting enough DHA, you're getting enough arachidonic acid, and the tiny amount of linoleic acid that you're getting in that diet doesn't matter really, because you're getting what you need already from the diet.
If I exclude seed oils from my diet completely, which I for the most part, pretty much do, I will live forever, never get heart disease, never get dementia, never get diabetes, and never get fat. Why would still people get those things even despite the fact they're removing it? What else might be problematic?
The only thing I can say for dead certain is that you won't live forever.
Damn.
Sorry.
Damn.
Whether it's cutting seed oils or eating a carnivore diet, I don't think either one of those is going to do the trick, unfortunately. Now, it's interesting. The most successful heart disease study that we have is the Lyon Diet Heart Study, where they took people with cardiovascular disease and they lowered their intake of linoleic acid and increased their intake of alpha-linoleic acid, the omega-3 fat that's in canola oil. And they found a 70% reduction in cardiovascular disease, right? That's the most successful dietary trial we have in history for reducing heart disease. Problem becomes, if you're raised eating this stuff, your tissues are going to be saturated in it, right? And that's not just your blood and your adipose tissues, right? Consuming seed oils rapidly changes the composition of cartilage. If your mother is eating seed oils when you're growing up, it's going to affect the composition of the lens in your eye, right? And an increased level of polyunsaturated there predisposes you to a couple different types of blindness, including cataracts. The big question is, if you do like I did and you cut this out of your diet years ago, are you going to be able to prevent heart disease for the rest of your life? I don't know. I think I've lowered my risk dramatically because that's what the research shows. I certainly know that all of my chronic health conditions have gone away. I lost weight almost immediately, and I've been weight stable for years now without counting calories. And it took 4 years for my fatty liver disease liver enzymes to normalize, right? 4 years is a long time. But on the other hand, that's a disease for which we don't have a treatment. So 4 years is pretty bloody good in that context. So yeah, I think you may still have some residual risks just because you have all of these fats in your body. And I don't know that it's possible to get yourself back to the level that you would be at if you were living in the Amazon jungle and you'd never seen a seed oil in your entire life.
Maybe it's not known, but like you said, we incorporate these things in our fats for long-term storage. How long does it take us to get rid of those things? Do we know? I've seen several years half-lives on these things. What do you know about that?
Yeah, the only half-life study was actually in consumption, and that was done back in the 1960s. And what they found was that the half-life that they derived from that was, if I remember correctly, I think it's like 480 days. So a year and a half. If you do the math, that means it's going to take you 4 to 5 years to get back down to what we think is an evolutionarily appropriate level of these fats in your adipose tissue. Now, in skin, in my experience, and in the experience of lots of other people who discover that they don't sunburn anymore when they go on a carnivore or a low seed oil diet, that happens in weeks, but your skin cell turnover is rapid and is measured in days, whereas fat is measured in a year and a half. And tissues, like I've heard turnover rates for cartilage for the cells in cartilage to be 50 to 100 years. And for your cornea, the lens in your eye, the core cells there never turn over, right? You have the fats and the cells that you're born with for your entire life.
Outside of abstinence from these oils, which say are problematic, anything else we can do to clear that from our system? Is exercise? Is there any supplements or anything else that are chelation therapy, sauna? I don't know. Things that might accelerate this process, perhaps, to improve it.
Yeah. Fasted training. You want to burn fat. You want to clear out your fat cells as quickly as possible. I'm a big fan of endurance training. There's good evidence. There's no, as far as I'm concerned, resistance versus endurance argument here. Both of them are beneficial, but they have different effects for purposes of protecting your body against oxidative damage from seed oils. Endurance exercise is the more beneficial protocol. Ideally, do it when you're fasted. Do it first thing in the morning. Go for a run before you have breakfast. And your body will be forced to produce fat from fat cells for you to burn. And as I'm sure we all know, when we go on a low carb diet, like a carnivore diet or a paleo diet, often your appetite alters and you find that skipping meals, skipping breakfast, and sometimes skipping lunch isn't a problem at all. So I think that's a great thing to do if you want to try and get rid of these fats in your body. There's some evidence in humans that these are preferentially burned off. It's not a super huge effect, but they do seem to be released from adipose cells faster than the other fats. You want to reduce concentrated sources, of course, which is the seed oils themselves, processed foods made with seed oils, and then animals that are fed concentrated amounts of seed oils like chicken, pork. Chicken is actually the biggest source of linoleic acid in the US diet, surprisingly, and things like fatty farm-raised salmon. Things that you can take, antioxidants that protect against seed oil consumption. Carnosine, which is contained in red meat, is one of the best. It specifically protects you against HNE, which is the best studied toxin that linoleic acid turns into in the body. So if you go on an all beef diet, you get the double whammy of lowering your linoleic acid consumption dramatically, and then also taking one of the best antioxidants against linoleic acid toxicity in the body. Selenium is the building block, is the core element in the molecule glutathione, which is one of the primary antioxidants in the body, protecting you against all sorts of toxicity, not just including seed oil toxicity. Some of the recent, vitamin E is a antioxidant that protects from linoleic acid toxicity in some contexts. There's good human data showing that it actually accelerates cardiovascular disease, but that's only in the context of a normal American diet with a lot of linoleic acid. And that's because, surprisingly enough, in the circumstance of having linoleic acid in your lipoproteins, vitamin E can actually accelerate the oxidation of the linoleic acid. Now, if you're taking it in the context of a low linoleic acid diet, I don't really know what effect that will have. There was a mouse model that just came out where they looked at its ability to protect fatty liver disease, and it does it quite effectively. There's something to be said for vitamin E supplementation, possibly with the caveat about heart disease there. And then a ketogenic diet is protective against linoleic acid toxicity to an extent because it allows your body to actually use the toxins as fuel and burn them off, which I think is one of the reasons why ketogenic diets are beneficial. So those are the main things that I would recommend. I think longer term, a ketogenic diet is probably not necessary. I think intermittent ketogenesis, where you're going into and out of ketogenesis, is probably the normal human state of affairs. And if you're able to get yourself to the point where you've cured your diabetes and you're not worried about this stuff anymore, you should be able to eat some amount of carbohydrates with no negative impact on your health, except maybe for cavities.
Yeah, let me ask you about the cavity, because if I eliminate seed oils from my diet, I can swill as many Coca-Colas as I want, and I can eat all the sugar I want, right? It's a sugar-free for all, I'm being told by some. Is that not accurate? What are your thoughts on that?
It's so funny because I talk to dietitians and they're like, carbohydrates are a perfectly healthy food. And I'm like, they rot your face. Do you really think we can call something that rots your face healthy? Sugar is super effective at inducing cavities. So that's a problem. I say this as somebody who has went on a super low sugar diet when I was 18 or 19, and I got sick of visits to the dentist to have my cavities repaired. And he finally told me, just quit sugar, then you won't have any more cavities. Behold, he was right. Thanks, Doc. But there's definitely, when they do fructose feeding experiments in humans, it's rather amusing. What they use to measure the negative effect of fructose are oxidized linoleic acid metabolites like oxidized LDL or HNE, right? So there's definitely something going on where excess fructose consumption is causing faster oxidation of linoleic acid metabolites in the body, right? And we've seen this in alcohol, fatty liver experiments where, if you feed mice beef tallow, they can take 30% of calories as ethanol, and they're fine, right? 30% of calories as ethanol is a lot. But if you switch them over to polyunsaturated fats, they start getting fatty liver disease almost immediately. Yeah, you could definitely, I eat more sugar now than I used to, just because when I started looking into Weston Price's cavity healing diet, he used more sugar than I was consuming. So I said, okay, if I have a healthy diet, I can probably get away with a little bit more. Let's not kid ourselves. Too much sugar has clear negative effects on human health, starting with what you see when you look in the mirror.
Yeah, fair enough. Tucker, unfortunately, we're running out of time. This has been wonderful. We should probably do another one and not go so long between discussions, because I think it's some fascinating stuff. And I think I continue to applaud you for getting that information out there. And like I said, obviously there's a lot of backlash to this, and who's right, who's wrong, we'll see in the end. I think you can look in the mirror and figure out ways to figure out what the right course is. But thanks so much for doing this. And for the rest of the folks, thanks for joining in. Got to go.
Thank you for what you're doing. It's great to see you're having such an impact. It's just awesome.
Yeah, we're trying different things. Sometimes I have to put on a stupid wig.
Oh, anyway, that was hilarious.
Yeah, I thought it was quite fun to do.
Bravo, you're a brave man.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. Thanks everybody for doing that. Tucker, thank you so much. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Thanks everybody. Bye-bye now.